Deadly battle, bull versus buffalo. Who survives the Roman arena? If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and comment telling us where you're listening from. Dr. Marcus Aurelius Fletcher stood in the dusty archives of the National Museum of Rome, holding a recently discovered manuscript that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about Roman spectacles. The parchment, dated to 127 CE during Emperor Hadrian's reign, described in vivid detail an event that had never been recorded in mainstream historical texts, a battle between two massive bovines in the Colosseum that ended in a way no one expected. Marcus, a professor of ancient history at the Australian National University, had been studying Roman animal spectacles for 20 years. He'd read accounts of lions versus bears, gladiators versus wild beasts, elaborate hunts involving dozens of exotic animals, but this document described something different, something that spoke not to Roman cruelty, but to an unexpected moment of connection that had moved an entire crowd to tears and changed imperial policy. The manuscript was written by a veterinarian named Gaius Marius, who'd been responsible for the care of animals used in the arena. His account began with the arrival of two remarkable specimens, a massive white bull from Germania and an equally impressive black water buffalo from Egypt, both gifts to Emperor Hadrian from distant provinces. Marcus began translating the ancient Latin, his excitement growing with each passage. According to Gaius Marius, the bull, called Titan by his handlers, weighed over 1,200 Roman pounds and stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. His horns curved forward like spears, and his temperament was famously aggressive. He'd killed 2 handlers during transport and had to be kept in isolation. The buffalo, named Nilus after the great river, was even larger, his dark hide scarred from fights with crocodiles in his homeland. Water buffalo were rare in Rome, exotic enough that most citizens had never seen one. Nilus had a reputation for intelligence and unpredictable violence. He'd trampled a merchant who tried to prod him with a stick, and the Egyptian traders who'd brought him warned that he was more dangerous than any lion. The decision to pit them against each other had come from the emperor himself, who was fascinated by questions of strength and dominance among different species. Hadrian, known for his intellectual curiosity, wanted to see which animal would prove superior, the aggressive bull of the northern forests or the massive buffalo of the Nile Delta. Preparations for the spectacle took weeks. Both animals were kept in separate holding areas beneath the Colosseum, fed premium grain, and given medical treatment to ensure they'd be in peak condition for the fight. Gaius Marius recorded his growing unease as the date approached. Unlike gladiatorial combat, which at least involved human choice and training, this would be pure animal violence for entertainment. He'd signed up to care for beasts, not facilitate their deaths. The day of the battle arrived during the Saturnalia festival, when Rome was at its most decadent and the crowd's appetite for spectacle was insatiable. The Colosseum was packed with 50,000 spectators, from senators in the premium seats to plebeians in the upper tiers. The emperor himself sat in the imperial box, flanked by his advisors and foreign dignitaries. Gaius Marius's account described the atmosphere in vivid detail. The crowd roared with anticipation as the gates on opposite sides of the arena floor began to open. Handlers used long poles and controlled burns to force the animals toward the arena, staying as far away as possible from the deadly horns. Titan emerged first, his white hide almost glowing in the afternoon sun. He pawed at the sand, his massive neck muscles bunching as he bellowed a challenge that echoed through the stone amphitheater. The crowd went wild, cheering for the Germanic beast, many having placed substantial bets on his victory. Then Nilus appeared, and the noise intensified. The buffalo was a marvel to Roman eyes, so different from their familiar cattle. His massive head hung low, his curved horns sweeping backward, his dark eyes scanning the arena with obvious intelligence. He didn't bellow or paw like Titan. He simply stood there, assessing, calculating, while the crowd screamed for blood. For a long moment, the two animals regarded each other across 30 meters of sand. Gaius Marius wrote that he'd never seen such a tense stillness before a fight. Usually animals would charge immediately, driven by territory or fear, but these two seemed to understand that this was different, that one of them would likely die in the next few minutes. Titan moved first, breaking into a trot and then a charge, his hooves throwing up clouds of sand. The crowd rose to their feet, roaring. This was what they'd come for, the moment of impact, the clash of titans. Nilus stood his ground until the last possible second, then shifted sideways with surprising agility for his size. Titan's horn passed within inches of the buffalo's flank, and Nilus responded by swinging his own head, catching Titan across the shoulder with enough force to stagger the bull. First blood went to the buffalo. A long gash opened across Titan's white hide, crimson streaming down his leg. The crowd's roar intensified. Some cheered for Nilus, others screamed encouragement to Titan. Money was changing hands at incredible rates as betting odds shifted with every exchange. The animals circled each other, both now understanding the danger they faced. Titan shook his head, blood spraying across the sand, and charged again. This time Nilus didn't dodge. The two animals met head-on with a crack that Gaius Marius compared to thunder, a sound that momentarily silenced even the roaring crowd. Both animals staggered backward, their horns locked together, necks straining as each tried to gain the advantage. The buffalo's superior weight gave him leverage. He began forcing Titan backward, step by step, his hooves digging trenches in the sand. But Titan had the advantage of aggression, the wild fury that came from his Germanic bloodlines. He twisted suddenly, breaking the lock, and gored Nilus in the side before the buffalo could react. Now both animals were bleeding. Nilus's wound was deeper, more serious. Dark blood matted his black hide, dripping onto the pale sand. The crowd was in absolute frenzy, senators abandoning their dignity to scream along with the common people. This was proving to be the greatest animal spectacle in recent memory. Gaius Marius wrote that he'd positioned himself near the emperor's box, along with other handlers who carried spears in case the animals needed to be put down quickly if the fight went too long. He noted that Emperor Hadrian was leaning forward in his seat, his face intense with concentration, watching every movement of the combatants with the focus of a military strategist analyzing a battlefield. The battle continued for what Gaius estimated as nearly half an hour, an eternity for such intense physical combat. The animals were both tiring now, their movements slower, their breathing labored. Titan's white hide was streaked with blood from multiple wounds. Nilus was limping slightly, favoring his injured side. It was then that something remarkable happened. Titan charged again, but this time Nilus didn't meet the charge or dodge. Instead, the buffalo simply stopped moving, his head lowered, his eyes fixed on the approaching bull. Titan, committed to his charge, couldn't stop in time. His horns drove into Nilus's shoulder, and for a moment it seemed the buffalo would go down. But Nilus didn't fall. Instead, he made a sound that Gaius Marius described as unlike anything he'd heard from cattle before. Not a bellow of rage or pain, but something softer, almost plaintive, and incredibly, impossibly, Titan stopped pushing. The bull stepped back, his horns withdrawing from the buffalo's flesh, and the two animals stood facing each other, both bleeding, both exhausted. The crowd's noise began to change. Confusion replaced bloodlust. What were the animals doing? Why had they stopped fighting? Handlers looked at each other uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene. Gaius Marius wrote that what happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Nilus, the massive buffalo who'd killed crocodiles and trampled men, slowly lowered himself to the sand. Not collapsing from injury, but deliberately lying down, exposing his vulnerable throat and belly to Titan. It was a gesture of submission, of surrender, but also of something more. Trust, perhaps. Recognition that continuing this fight served neither of them. Titan stood over the prone buffalo, his horns positioned perfectly to deliver a killing blow. The crowd fell silent, 50,000 people holding their breath, waiting for the final strike. Emperor Hadrian leaned so far forward he was nearly out of his seat. But Titan didn't strike. The white bull lowered his head and touched his muzzle to Nilus's face in what could only be described as a gesture of peace. Then Titan, too, lowered himself to the sand, lying down beside the buffalo. Two mortal enemies, who moments before had been trying to kill each other, now lay side by side, like old companions resting after a long day's work. The silence in the Colosseum was absolute. No one knew how to react to what they were witnessing. This wasn't how animal fights were supposed to end. There should be a victor and a vanquished, a corpse and a champion. Not this strange, peaceful tableau of two wounded animals choosing coexistence over continued violence. It was Emperor Hadrian who finally responded. He stood from his seat, and the entire crowd's attention shifted to him. Gaius Marius recorded that the emperor's face showed something he'd never seen before in the arena, genuine emotion, perhaps even tears. Hadrian raised his hand, the traditional signal for mercy in gladiatorial combat. The crowd erupted, not in disappointment, but in approval. What they'd witnessed had touched something deeper than bloodlust, had reminded them that even in an empire built on conquest and violence, there was still room for mercy and unexpected connection. The emperor ordered both animals to be removed from the arena, treated for their wounds, and retired to his private estates, where they would live out their days in comfort. No more fighting, no more spectacle. They'd earned their peace. As handlers carefully approached the two animals, Gaius Marius noted something extraordinary. Titan and Nilus allowed themselves to be led away, but they kept looking back at each other, as if unwilling to be separated. The veterinarian made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He approached Emperor Hadrian and requested that the animals be housed together, arguing that separating them now would be cruel after what they'd shared. Hadrian agreed, intrigued by this unprecedented situation. And so Titan and Nilus were transported to the imperial farms outside Rome, their wounds treated, their recovery monitored by Gaius Marius himself, who'd requested assignment as their permanent caretaker. Dr. Fletcher paused in his translation, hardly believing what he was reading. The manuscript went on to describe the years that followed, and what it revealed was even more extraordinary than the arena battle itself. Gaius Marius documented the recovery process in meticulous detail. Both animals had sustained serious injuries, Nilus's goring wound particularly concerning, but with careful treatment, regular cleaning of wounds, and the application of various Roman remedies that actually had some medical efficacy, both animals survived and began to heal. More remarkable was the relationship that developed between them. Kept in adjacent pastures initially, as handlers weren't sure if housing them together was safe, Titan and Nilus spent their days at the fence line between their enclosures, as close to each other as they could get. When feeding time came, both animals would only eat if they could see the other. If one was taken for medical treatment, the other would become agitated, pacing and calling out. After 2 weeks, Gaius Marius made the decision to remove the dividing fence. He recorded that he did so against the advice of other handlers who feared the animals would resume fighting, but his instinct proved correct. When the barrier was removed, Titan and Nilus approached each other cautiously, touched noses, and then simply began grazing side by side as if they'd been pasture mates their entire lives. Emperor Hadrian, fascinated by this development, began visiting the imperial farms regularly to observe the unusual pair. The emperor, who was himself known for his complex relationship with violence, having expanded the empire through military conquest while also being a patron of arts and philosophy, seemed to find something meaningful in the story of these two warriors who'd chosen peace. Gaius Marius wrote about conversations with Hadrian during these visits. The emperor would stand at the fence for hours, watching Titan and Nilus graze together, rest in the shade together, drink from the same water trough. He spoke to Gaius about the nature of violence, whether it was truly natural or simply a choice that circumstances forced upon beings who might prefer peaceful coexistence. These animals, Hadrian had said according to the manuscript, understood something in that arena that took me 40 years of warfare to learn. That victory and defeat matter less than survival and connection. They could have fought to the death, satisfied the crowd's bloodlust and my curiosity. Instead, they showed us all something far more valuable. The emperor's philosophical musings aside, the practical reality was that Titan and Nilus had become something of a sensation in Rome. People traveled from across the empire to see the Battle Brothers, as they'd become known. Their story was told in taverns, written about by poets, discussed in philosophical circles as an example of reason overcoming base instinct. Dr. Fletcher found references in the manuscript to other historical sources, and he spent the next several days cross-referencing Gaius Marius's account with other Roman texts. To his amazement, he found confirming evidence. A poem by Marcus Argentarius mentioned the white and black who chose brotherhood over bloodshed. A letter from a senator complained about the emperor's wasteful sentimentality in maintaining expensive animals who served no practical purpose. Even Hadrian's own writings, in a journal entry from 128 CE, mentioned visiting the bulls who taught me that even enemies can become brothers. But it was the final section of Gaius Marius's manuscript that truly moved Dr. Fletcher. The veterinarian described the last years of both animals' lives and the impact they had on Roman policy regarding arena spectacles. Titan and Nilus lived for another 6 and 7 years respectively, an impressive lifespan given their injuries and the stress they'd endured. They remained inseparable throughout, so bonded that handlers learned to work with them as a unit rather than as individuals. When one became ill, the other would stand vigil. When one was in pain, the other would show obvious signs of distress. Emperor Hadrian, moved by this enduring friendship, began to reconsider the arena spectacles he'd inherited and perpetuated. While he didn't end animal combat entirely, his policies became notably more restrictive. Gaius Marius recorded that the emperor issued an edict in 131 CE, 3 years after the famous battle, limiting the types of animal combat that could be staged in imperial arenas. The edict, which Dr. Fletcher later found referenced in other historical documents, prohibited fights between animals of similar size and strength where both combatants would likely suffer serious injury. It encouraged more one-sided hunts where skilled hunters would face dangerous animals in a controlled environment, theoretically giving the animals a fighting chance while reducing prolonged, brutal combat between evenly matched beasts. The policy was controversial, with many Romans viewing it as unwelcome interference in traditional entertainment, but Hadrian held firm, and his influence was such that the changes were implemented throughout the empire. Gaius Marius suggested that the emperor's decision was directly influenced by what he'd witnessed between Titan and Nilus, though Hadrian himself never publicly stated this connection. When Titan died in 133 TCE, Nilus stopped eating. Despite Gaius Marius's best efforts, the buffalo declined rapidly, dying just 9 days after his companion. The veterinarian wrote movingly about those final days, watching Nilus stand vigil over Titan's body, refusing to leave, making sounds of grief that affected everyone who heard them. Emperor Hadrian, informed of both deaths, ordered that the animals be buried together on the imperial estate, an unprecedented honor for non-sacred animals. He commissioned a stone marker, and Gaius Marius included a description of the inscription in his manuscript. The inscription read, in Latin, "Here lie Titan and Nilus, who fought as enemies and died as brothers, teaching an empire that even warriors can choose peace." Dr. Fletcher sat back from the manuscript, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just an interesting historical footnote. This was evidence of a pivotal moment in Roman attitudes toward violence and spectacle, a moment that had been lost to mainstream history but had apparently influenced imperial policy at the highest levels. He spent the next year working with the manuscript, translating every word, cross-referencing every claim, building a case for its authenticity and significance. His resulting paper, published in the Journal of Roman Studies, caused a sensation in academic circles. The story of Titan and Nilus became widely known, discussed not just by historians but by ethologists studying animal behavior, philosophers examining the nature of violence and peace, and even contemporary activists working on animal welfare. But Dr. Fletcher wanted to do more than publish an academic paper. He wanted to find physical evidence, the burial site that Gaius Marius had described. Using the veterinarian's detailed descriptions of the imperial estate's location, along with modern archaeological techniques and ground-penetrating radar, Fletcher organized an excavation. The dig took place over 6 months, a joint operation between the Australian National University, the University of Rome, and the Italian Ministry of Culture. The site was located about 30 kilometers outside modern Rome, in an area that had indeed been part of an imperial estate during Hadrian's reign. They found the burial in the 4th month of excavation, 2 massive skeletons lying side by side, their bones showing evidence of healed injuries consistent with Gaius Marius's descriptions. The white bull and the black buffalo, separated by nearly 2,000 years from the living animals they'd once been, but still together as they'd chosen to be. Near the skeletons, the team found fragments of the stone marker, enough to reconstruct the inscription that Dr. Fletcher had read in the manuscript. The physical evidence matched the written account perfectly, confirming that Gaius Marius's extraordinary story was true. The discovery made international news. Images of the excavation, showing the 2 ancient skeletons lying peacefully side by side, were shared millions of times across social media. The story resonated deeply in a world torn by conflicts, a reminder from the distant past that even the fiercest enemies could find common ground, could choose understanding over continued violence. Museums around the world requested the bones for display, offering substantial sums. But the Italian government, in consultation with Dr. Fletcher and the international team, made a different decision. The skeletons would be reburied at the same site, with a new monument erected to tell their story. The location would become a small memorial park, free to the public, a place for reflection on the themes of reconciliation and the better nature that exists even in the midst of violence. Dr. Fletcher was invited to speak at the dedication of the memorial. Standing before a crowd of academics, government officials, and curious members of the public, he talked about what Titan and Nilus represented, not just to historians but to humanity as a whole. What happened in that arena in 127 CE, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd, wasn't just about 2 animals refusing to kill each other. It was about the capacity for reason to overcome instinct, for empathy to trump aggression, for unexpected connections to form even in the most unlikely circumstances. Titan and Nilus were forced into conflict by human entertainment, but they chose to end that conflict on their own terms. In doing so, they apparently influenced an emperor, changed policy, and left us with a story that still matters nearly 2,000 years later. The memorial itself was designed by an Italian sculptor, incorporating elements from both Germanic and Egyptian artistic traditions to honor the animal's origins. The centerpiece was a bronze statue showing Titan and Nilus not fighting, but standing peacefully side by side, their heads turned toward each other in the gesture of greeting that Gaius Marius had described them, sharing every day of their lives together. Beneath the statue, in Latin, Italian, and English, the original inscription was reproduced, along with a longer explanation of the story. Visitors could read Gaius Marius's account, see photographs of the excavation, and learn about Emperor Hadrian's policy changes that had been partially inspired by what he'd witnessed. The memorial opened on the anniversary of the battle, calculated from the dates in Gaius Marius's manuscript. Thousands attended, far more than the organizers had anticipated. People brought flowers, left notes, took photographs. Many stood in silence, processing the story and its implications. Dr. Fletcher watched the crowd, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. He'd spent his career studying the past, trying to understand the people and events that had shaped history, but rarely had his work felt so immediately relevant, so connected to contemporary concerns. The story of Titan and Nilus spoke to issues that still plagued humanity. The cycles of violence, the challenge of breaking those cycles, the possibility of reconciliation even after terrible conflict. In the months following the memorial's opening, something unexpected happened. Other historians began uncovering references to Titan and Nilus in documents that had previously been overlooked or misunderstood. The animals had apparently become symbols of peace in certain Roman philosophical circles. Their story was told to children as a moral lesson. Artists created works inspired by their friendship. Dr. Fletcher compiled these new findings into a second paper, then a book, exploring the cultural impact of Titan and Nilus's story in Roman society. The book became an unexpected bestseller, appealing to readers far beyond academic circles. Schools used it to teach about animal intelligence and the nature of conflict resolution. Peace organizations adopted the image of the two animals as a symbol. Years after his initial discovery, Dr. Fletcher returned to the memorial on a quiet autumn afternoon. The site had become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking inspiration, hope, or simply a reminder that change was possible. He stood before the bronze statue of Titan and Nilus, thinking about Gaius Marius, the veterinarian who'd cared enough to record their story, and Emperor Hadrian, who'd been wise enough to see its meaning. Two animals, forced to fight for human entertainment, had chosen a different path. In doing so, they'd created a moment of grace in the midst of an empire built on violence. They'd influenced policy, inspired art, and left a legacy that transcended their species and their time. And now, nearly 2,000 years later, they continued to teach that same lesson, that even in our darkest moments, even when violence seems inevitable, there's always the possibility of choosing peace instead.